Greetings. This is the midweek devotional for August 4th, 2021 from University United Methodist Church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I'm John Fletcher. I'm a member here at University, and now maybe you are a regular attendee or member here at University, or maybe you're a virtual visitor who's just happened upon this video. No matter who you are or where you're watching from, thank you for tuning in. So I wrote this sitting in my favorite coffee shop wearing a mask. Our governor has just reinstituted the indoor mask mandate in Louisiana due to a resurgence of the Delta COVID variant. Our positivity rate right now in East Baton Rouge is like 16.7%. And y'all, I'm just really disheartened. This may be a little bit of a rough go today. Remember how long we prayed last year for a vaccine, and then the fact that the vaccines came so quickly, that they were so effective, it just seemed like a miracle. And yet now, 6 months after the miracle, I really expected us to be in a different place. We had that month or two of wow, back to normal, and now I'm digging out my masks again. Our hospitals are filling up. We're losing people again. As I was writing this in the coffee shop, I couldn't help but overhear these two guys talking about the pandemic. One of them wore hospital scrubs and was wearing a mask, and he sounded, y'all, really rough, clearing his throat often, choking, like he was recovering from a bad cough, which, as I kept overhearing, they were very loud. In fact, he was recovering from long COVID. He had gotten COVID months ago, just a few days before he was to receive his first vaccine dose, and it's still with him. He spoke between coughs and throat clearing about learning to live with reduced lung capacity, hoping to get back to work. And his friend wore no mask, and his friend listened and seemed sympathetic, and then his friend said something that I have to say I have heard a lot of people say that, he doesn't have anything against people who are getting the vaccine or taking precautions. That's their choice. But he just resents being told what to do, so he won't do it because that's his choice. Y'all, I'm frustrated. I know I'm not alone in being stressed out and frustrated and angry and at a loss at various points during this pandemic, but I have to say I'm finding it hard. It is a struggle with my faith to let go of a lot of the sort of rage that I'm feeling right now, the grief that I'm feeling right now. The surge right now is even the most conservative Southern governors are saying, there's a resurgence of the unvaccinated. It's true, yes, some vaccinated folk can get the disease and pass it, but the vast majority of cases who get it, the vast majority of cases who have to go to the hospital, they are people who are not vaccinated. Some cases, people who cannot be vaccinated, children or maybe immunocompromised people, but for the most part, people who have simply chosen not to be vaccinated. The vaccines work, they're available for free, even with cash incentives sometimes, and yet about 40% of eligible people here in Louisiana, at least, are simply saying no. When I hear about people talking why they're hesitating or why they're just not going to wear a mask or why they're not going to avoid large crowds of unvaccinated people. Most of the time, the reasons involve just what the gentleman in the coffee shop said. It's my individual choice, and I resent the government telling me what to do. Why am I talking about this in a midweek devotional for church, right? I'm going to say that it has to do with miracles. So a few weeks ago, my sister Liz was asked to preach in her church where she's a member. She lives in Oklahoma City. And I got really excited because I always get a lot out of Liz's sermons, and I got a lot out of this one. This time, for her sermon, she tackled the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. You may know it, right? Basically, there's this huge crowd of people following and listening to Jesus. It's midday, they're tired and they're hungry, and the disciples say, Teacher, we need to let these people go so they can eat. And Jesus says to the disciples, You feed them. And they say, Well, how could we do that? And Jesus says, Well, see what food there is. And Andrew, one of the disciples, finds one boy who is willing to give up his 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 cooked fish. Jesus accepts these. He prays over the small meal and he breaks the bread and the fish and begins passing it around. And miraculously, that small amount is somehow enough. The huge crowd eats their fill. 12 basketfuls of leftovers get collected. And that, Liz says, is one of the go to miracles of Jesus. You know, it's included in all four of the Gospels. And for some people, she says, miracles like these form part of why they're Christians in the first place. Jesus feeding the 5,000, Jesus healing the sick, calming the storms, raising the dead, all of these are proof that Jesus is the Son of God, worthy of worship and praise. The problem is, my sister continues, that these miracles seem to be relegated to scripture. At least in our churches, we don't often see deaths reversed, or sicknesses vanished, or storms dissipated before they cause loss of life. And a lot of what Christians call miracles seem like to a lot of non-Christians like, luck or the effort of doctors. When it came clear, my sister says, that we were going to have to rely on one another to control the spread of COVID back, when this all began, she said I had some concerns. I mean, it became fairly apparent pretty quickly. It's easy enough to prevent the spread of COVID. You wash your hands, you cover your nose and mouth, you avoid close contact with others. Do those things and you protect not only yourself, you protect your vulnerable neighbors. Liz says I had seen enough to make me wonder whether we could pull it off. And the answer, she says, has basically been no in this country. Instead, the measures like wearing a mask, avoiding gatherings, and now the vaccine have become political footballs to be rejected or castigated as some badge of honor by members of a political tribe. My sister is a psychotherapist in Oklahoma City. She specializes in counseling people who are in the helping professions, people like nurses, other healthcare workers, teachers, ministers, other therapists. And she related some of the stories of the past year in treatment in her sermon. She says, my patients who are nurses, their exhausted faces broken out and red with irritation, told me of having to wear the same ragged N95 mask for months on the job because supplies of the mask had been gobbled up by hoarders. Domestic violence shelters were forced to ration soap, hand sanitizer, and toilet paper, which members of our community had filled their SUVs and garages with. Teachers doubled their workloads, writing online and in-person lesson plans, often driving to each student's house to drop off the learning packet, only to be told by an angry public that they weren't doing enough. Ministers worried about their vulnerable parishioners and sometimes their own compromised health as they developed under fire from angry parishioners new ways to maintain the community of Christ in crisis. And just last week, my sister says, a doctor broke down in tears as she told me of being cursed out by a patient in her rural community whom she had just diagnosed with COVID-19. She was accused of lying, this doctor was, of manipulating the test result to make more money somehow. The worst part, the doctor confided, is that the patient's going to call back in a week not able to breathe, and I'll have to send them to the emergency room 150 miles away because our hospital closed down 2 years ago after the state, Oklahoma, cut Medicaid reimbursements. Then my sister asks a terrible question. How do we reconcile all of this with the fact that 79% of people in Oklahoma identify as Christians? She says, we might expect a state where nearly 80% of folks identify Christ as their moral model. We might expect that they would follow what Christ himself identified as the second greatest commandment, to love our neighbor as ourselves. And because Jesus didn't want to leave any ambiguity about who our neighbor is, he was clear. Our neighbor is anyone in need. Our neighbor is anyone in need. And my sister asks, who was in need this past year? Who was the most vulnerable? Who needed the signs of care and compassion? And how did we as a community love them? I mean, I know I may be preaching to the converted here or having my sister preach to the converted. I'm guessing our faith community has a fairly high percentage of people who've worked to ensure the safety and well-being of our neighbors. But I also realize that when the world beyond our community thinks of the church, thinks of Christians, they don't often see the well-intended Christians. They see and hear the loudest voices, the TV preachers who are comparing themselves to martyrs for being asked not to hold unmasked and unvaccinated gatherings in enclosed spaces. Or the world hears the spokespeople and the pundits and the politicians who claim to be Christian while also saying, you know what, the most important thing is that it's my personal choice whether or not to protect my neighbors. We Christians share a communal witness to the world where sometimes the angriest and loudest of us stand in for all of us. My sister picks up on this. She says, what does it mean for us as the body of Christ, as living monuments to Christ's gospel, that our response to these neighbors in need this last year, and she's talking about the people who are most likely to get COVID and to suffer severely from it, often the response was to them, tough luck. What does it mean for the future of the church as a cultural force? What has changed so drastically about being a Christian that nowadays we have to hurry to get ahead of the judgmental, rigid stereotypes of Christians if we're admitting to someone that we're a person of faith? When did we have to start having to put a little asterisk next to Christian with the explanation, well, we're not kind of that kind of Christian, that our church isn't that kind of church? In truth, my sister says, I don't think much has changed. And she's very honest here, pointing out how the church communally, the communal witness of the church, has often participated in great historical wrongs: slavery, colonization and indigenous genocide, segregation, sexual abuse. The church, she says, has often been made up of ordinary human people, she says, and we have always been vulnerable to being led astray by our own selfish agendas. I didn't say I appreciated my sister's sermons because they're easy or comforting. And yet, my sister, in her sermon, does offer some comfort. She talks about her friend Melissa. Melissa is a single mother of two, someone who, like a lot of people, especially during this pandemic, has had to work multiple jobs, just barely keeping afloat financially. Yet last winter, Melissa's daughter, they were driving along, and Melissa's daughter saw a group of unhoused people standing outside in the freezing cold, begging for change or food. And she said, Mom, why are they there? And unable to give a good answer, Melissa began turning love into action. And now each month, she works with folks from the area to provide food and simple supplies. First hand warmers and warm socks, now water bottles, sleeping bags, clothes, shoes, soaps, masks, you name it, to people who are experiencing homelessness in Oklahoma City. And it's an organization she's formed called Scatter Kindness. Melissa is not rich or well off. She has plenty of to worry about just on her own. But, my sister says, like the child in our parable who gave his barley loaves, the food of the poor, and his fish to share with the multitude, Melissa, rather than insisting that she has the right to refuse to share with others, she simply decided to share anyway from what she had and could gather from other people who care. And that, my sister says, gives us another way to look at that miracle from the Bible. Some scholars actually speculate that rather than Jesus miraculously multiplying food, the boy's gesture of offering up his food shamed the crowd into sharing their own stashed food items until there was enough to feed everyone. I don't think that explanation diminishes the miraculous nature of what happened, Liz says. In fact, I think that's the real miracle if everyone in the crowd contributed. It's not that the 5 barley loaves and 2 fish could feed 5,000 people, but that one act of grace could inspire 5,000 people to find their own grace, to put aside their selfishness, to share with one another. I'll let her explain. After this past 18 months and in this new surge that we're experiencing, what could seem more miraculous than a hungry people taking only what they need for this meal and then passing the food basket to the next person who does the same? She says, if I had to judge by our behavior last spring, I'd have predicted that maybe person number 6 would fill their shirt, pants, and anything else they could stuff with barley and fish, or maybe person 32 would run off with a basket of food and claim they had the right to feed their own hungry family at home. Maybe person number 57 would even feel threatened and exercise their right to stand their ground when asked to pass the basket. Or what if person number 144 doesn't believe that there is a so-called hunger problem, so sets fire to the basket so no one gets a free meal? Or person number 1072 gets suspicious about how quickly this whole barley and fish meal came to be and starts telling everyone it's actually poison, they shouldn't touch it. You have to admit, she says, that sounds a lot more like 21st century Oklahoma, 21st century America, than everyone sharing with one another, feeling grateful, nobody taking more than their fair share. She says, I'm not being facetious when I say that it is a miracle that everyone shared. She says, I literally believe it is. In fact, my one gift my pandemic experience has given me is to see every act of human kindness and divine grace as a miracle. We humans don't do grace very well, she says. Why should we? Grace is God's power in living form. It doesn't come from us. We don't control it. So she says, when I see Melissa go out into downtown Oklahoma City like a living beacon of God's grace, when I hear my clients' stories of the heroic work they do in the classroom or in clinics, hospitals, offices, homes, churches, all over the state, when I see someone just willing to be a little less comfortable for a little bit by getting vaccinated or wearing a mask for the sake of protecting the health of someone they may not even know, that's when I feel that God is alive in this world. That kind of heroism, she says, moves me to tears. That we serve a Christ who made acts like this the centerpiece of his earthly ministry, that he instructed us to do the same. That should be a constant, humbling inspiration to us. And she ends, I don't have much else to say, honestly. My grief, my disillusionment about the behavior I've seen coming from good Christian people this past year, my grief at the rage and deep hurt I can't seem to let go of, the pain and exhaustion I witness all day, which unfeeling good people inflict on those in the front lines, frankly, it's all just a little too much for me. I don't know how to grieve that the people of Christ don't believe sometimes that they should care about other people. So she says, I'll just keep my eyes on Melissa. I'll keep supporting her ministry financially. I'll keep looking to her for an example of what I can aspire to. If I can loosen my grip on my hurt and open my eyes to the generosity that God's grace makes available every day. That generosity, she says, is my heritage too, and yours. All we have to do to lay claim to it is trust that God's grace is more compelling than our hurt and fear, no matter how or what we may feel hurt by or afraid of. I invite you, she says, to join me in praying for the strength to do that. My thanks to my sister, Liz Fletcher, for those terrible questions, that searing honesty, and that picture of grace. And my thanks to all you listening to this, many of whom I know you put love into action just as Melissa does. You put aside the right that you do have to make it your choice. And instead, you follow what Christ did. And I would challenge you, when you hear about university or your local congregation's monthly contributions to a local food pantry, when you hear calls to volunteer for a ministry that reaches out to the community, to those most vulnerable, when you're asked just to wear a mask, to get a vaccine, to participate in the repair of our broken world, and to better Christianity's collective witness, please, please do so. May God's grace and peace move us this week to share what we have, to put our neighbors first. Thank you.